Hello eavesdroppers, it's Amish Inquisition time yet again on Sunday the 25th of August 2019. I'm Amish Phil, Amish Matt is in the house.
Hello everyone.
Amish Ben is here.
Hi.
And this week we're joined in the studio with a very special guest, Peter Jones. Peter is an orgonomy researcher, author and founder of CORE, the Centre for Orgonomic Research and Education. Hello Peter.
Hello everybody.
How are you?
I'm fine, thanks.
Good.
Pleased to be here.
Good. We're pleased to have you. Thanks for doing this. I thought we'd start off basically with a little short background of you, your personal background, and how you first got, well, how you first came across orgonomy as a subject, and how that all came to fruition.
Well, it's an unlikely story, and my background, in a way, is unlikely. I've done a lot of scientific work recently in the last 10 years or so, but my background is quite the opposite. I've got a degree in languages, and almost by accident, because that was the only thing I was any good at school, and I couldn't stand science at school, ironically, even though I would have flat bursting with scientific equipment now. I did a languages degree at London University many years ago, and started earning a very ordinary living teaching English to foreign students.
Right.
And I came across Wilhelm Reich, who is the founder of orgonomy, the man whose ideas and discoveries and theories are the basis of orgonomy. I came across him quite by accident, in the way you do. I just met somebody who was very seriously into Reich, as people would have said in those days. And he kept badgering me to borrow a book from him that he wanted me to read.
What year was this, Peter?
This would be in the early 1960s.
Oh.
A long time ago. I've been at it for 50 odd years now. And I was very resistant to this pressure, as I always am. You know, if someone comes along and suggests to me that they've got the answer to every problem of the universe, as long as I read such and such a book or do such and such a thing, I'm automatically want to push them back and say, hold on, you know, let's have a proper look at it. So I was very resistant.
Sceptical by nature.
Exactly, yeah. And in the end, I said, okay, give me the bloody thing, you know. If it'll shut you up for a few days, I'll read it, you know. And at the time, I'd started to get interested in psychology, as an amateur, as it were, you know. And I was reading around psychology, people who were big names in the day, and not getting very far, not finding it very interesting, and not finding any answers to the questions I was asking in my own head. Which were the fairly typical questions of a sort of frustrated, angry adolescent boy who was lively and interested in things, but just felt that the version of life and the world that was being thrown at me by school teachers and my parents didn't quite click somehow. And I wanted to find answers to these questions myself. And so I borrowed Reich's The Function of the Orgasm, as it was called, and it's still the only book by Reich in print in the UK. And it is his classic biography, the book for anyone to read at the beginning. And I started reading it, full of scepticism, expecting it to be another boring psychology textbook. And it wasn't at all, you know. It went straight to the point about all these things that I was interested in particular why was everybody such a hypocrite? That was one of the things I'd noticed as a child, that people would preach one thing and do another. Everybody I met, my parents, the vicar, the local doctor, all my dad's business cronies, everybody, you know, preached one thing and did another thing. And that kept getting to me as a small child. As I grew up. And I'd also become interested in politics. And of course, people of my age, I was born just as the war was starting. Obviously, wasn't aware of that. But it was still a huge thing hanging there during the war and afterwards, you know, World War II. What had happened? What was it all about and why? And who was this big baddie Hitler, you know, and what had he done and why was he so terrible?
Something our generation can't
comprehend that, really, can you?
No.
I think of it, if you imagine a huge fire that leaves a great big black cloud of smoke in the sky, it was like that wherever you looked in sort of 1945, 1950 onwards. People still talked about the war. You met people who fought in the war. The war was the thing, you know, that everybody talked about. And then people, of course, started making films about it. The great British myth, you know, the wonderful Brits surviving the Blitz and D-Day and things like that. People of my age were just brought up on that, you know. You couldn't get away from it. And I think as a small child, probably war was one of the first words I'd have known because it was in almost every sentence that a grown-up uttered, you know. Yeah. Everything was before the war or was going to be after the war or when the war's over, and you couldn't do this and you couldn't do that because there's a war on.
Well, rationing went on for years after the war
1953.
ended. Yeah.
Absolutely, and that was very much part and parcel of the war. So that was part of the questions I was asking, you know, what had happened and why. And, of course, by the time I was a teenager, I was finding out about the war and the slaughter of the Jews and the fantastic numbers of people that were killed one way or another. Although the actual war hardly ever touched me, you know, up in suburban northwest. There were no air bases nearby. I never saw soldiers firing guns in anger or anything like that.
Were you evacuated?
No.
No.
Because I was already, you know, living in fairly safe suburbia. The nearest bomb that I ever heard about was about 2 miles away. Dropped on a church and knocked the steeple down. I think it was a pilot dumping his load before he scarpered from bombing Liverpool. He lived about 10 miles away from Liverpool.
Right.
And Reich, of course, homed in on fascism and authoritarianism and the social currents that brought Hitler to power through popular support. So he fed into that straight away. And that's still a lasting interest of mine, why people buckle down to authoritarianism and even seek it. Still, you know, even nowadays, people are seeking authoritarian solutions to social and psychological and political problems. It's really taken off again.
Yeah.
So Reich seems as relevant now as he ever was.
As far as his psychoanalytical work,
Yes.
writings go.
Yes.
Yeah.
And after reading The Function, which detailed a story of his involvement in psychoanalysis and getting to know Sigmund Freud and studying with Freud and learning how to be a psychoanalyst, that's what that book's about. And the social background to Reich's first acquaintance with psychoanalysis and the lack of contact that Freud and his people seemed to make with the political issues of the day. Reich was very involved with politics, and Freud and company seemed to just want to forget that.
Yeah.
And that was the cause of quite a big split between Freud and Reich. And the next book I read was an earlier one, but it was called The Mass Psychology of Fascism, and it was a psychoanalytic study of people's tendency, you know, to be attracted towards authoritarian solutions, and in particular tub-thumping, exciting, militant social solutions. And this is what Reich really homed in on. He compared what Hitler offered with the bands and the flags and the drum beats and the excitement and fun and the sort of Hitler youth and the camps and everything. And he compared that to German trade unionists trying to lecture the workers on Marxist economics. And who's going to win, you know? Hitler won hands down, of course.
Yeah.
And that was an approach to politics that was totally new, homing in on the psychology of it, the excitement of
Well,
it.
that's what I was going to say. It seems like it was completely different. That's maybe why it was
So
disregarded.
successful.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, Reich's the mass psychology of fascism was why they didn't like it being published, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah.
That book would have got him, had he stayed in Germany, it would have got him executed.
Right, so he had to leave Germany, was it in 39? Was it after
No, he left before then. He left in 33.
Right.
He started out in Vienna with Freud. And in 1930, he moved to Berlin. He was a citizen of what had been the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so presumably was a citizen of the Austrian Republic. He moved to Berlin in 1930, worked as a prominent and active psychoanalyst and also a political activist until 1933. And when Hitler came to power, he had to scarper in no uncertain manner, like lots of people.
Yeah. Einstein, was he one? Did he leave?
Loads of people, lots of...
Later, I think.
was he not...
That was maybe after the war, maybe.
Was he not born into a Jewish family, but not raised as a Jew or something
Exactly.
like that?
He would have been counted as a Jew by the Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
So that was another reason for executing him. And he would have been executed a third time over because he'd been a communist.
Yeah.
Right.
So he was really doomed if he stayed. He went to Scandinavia and moved about between Denmark and Sweden and Norway, and eventually, after a year on the sort of living out of a suitcase, as it were, he settled in Norway until 1939 and did some of his very important work there. That's where he discovered the orgone energy, and he developed his psychoanalysis into his body-orientated therapy. He was the first therapist of any sort to start paying attention to how people breathed, digging into their muscles, pointing out to them how they stood, how their voices sounded, incorporating bodily stance and position and
Posture.
Exactly, as opposed to just what people said. Right. And I think it's worth mentioning that I think what fed him into this direction was his own body awareness of his interpretations bouncing off patients when he was doing talky psychoanalysis. And he would try to point out to people how they were trying to escape from facing up to unwelcome things. And they just, kept him at arm's length. And he experienced that as a body feeling. I bring that up because Reich's psychology is still by many people neglected and ridiculed, but everyone knows that experience of talking to a brick wall.
Yeah.
People say it, don't they? Oh, don't talk to him, you might as well talk to a brick wall. And that's what Reich technically named a resistance, a character resistance, a way of keeping the world at bay, keeping other people at bay, or keeping your own internal feelings at bay.
Right.
And that's one of my little axes which I grind a lot, is this idea that although you can read Reich's books and they're technical and maybe a bit difficult in places and you might need a dictionary to read them, in fact, most ordinary people know what he's talking about if you talk about it in ordinary words.
Because it's everyone's lived experience.
Exactly. And everybody knows what it's like to talk to someone who feels like a brick wall, don't they? We all know it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So how did he sort of go from psychoanalysis into orgonomy then?
He developed a particular school of psychoanalysis, which he called character analysis, which was still talky therapy, interpreting what the patient said, the verbal material the patient presented. And he gradually focused more and more on how his patients behaved, not just what they said, but how they said it and how they sat, and even how they remained silent. You see, in conventional psychoanalysis, if the patient remains totally silent and doesn't say a thing, you're lumbered. But with Reich's approach, the silence is eloquent as anything you might say.
Mm-hmm.
And he initially just started pointing out how people stood and sat and spoke, and more focused on how they behaved. And he eventually started actually touching them, digging into tense muscles, mobilizing their breathing.
Right.
Looking in their eyes and asking them to look in his eyes. He invented a very clever way for mobilizing people's eyes, and discovered that eyes are one of the ways for controlling feelings. And there's a wonderful part of one of his books called Character Analysis, where he goes through what he calls the segments. It's called the segmental arrangement of the armouring, starting with the eyes, the mouth, the neck, the chest, the diaphragm, the abdomen, and the pelvis. And as you can imagine, again, you don't need to be a psychology graduate to twig on that certain feelings belong to certain parts of the body.
Mm. That's what when I was reading about him, I wanted to ask about armouring.
Yes.
And what that was. Is that essentially how you hold yourself?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you tense up and your shoulders go
That's
up like that, that would be an example, would it?
Now, listeners can't see Phil here, but he's mimed beautifully. Someone very tense with his shoulders up by his ears, and I bet if I poked your chest would all be rigid and hard.
Yeah.
And if someone was sitting about relaxing in a pub and someone walks through the door like that, you'll think, God, he's tense, isn't he? You know, he's uptight, she's uptight. Everybody recognises that.
Yeah.
And Reich would have poked about in those muscles, tried to move the arms and the shoulders, keeping the patient breathing, reminding them to breathe, reminding them when they stop breathing. And slowly things would come to the surface. The situation that produced those tight, tense shoulders that you're talking about, or dead eyes, or a rigid jaw, you know, a square jaw that looks like a hammer or an axe or something. And once you start thinking in these terms, you can think of someone who looks like that, a friend, you know, a relative, or a teacher, or somebody, you know that you have to interact with at work, who does that, who looks like that, whose voice sounds like that. It's quite accessible, actually. It's not high-flown. It's not academic or technical or intellectual.
It seems like a collaboration between sort of reading body language, and then to a lesser extent, sort of when he starts moving the muscles around, massage, physiotherapy,
Yoga, the breathing,
yoga,
breathing exercises.
Was he an early exponent of all these things?
He was. He was the first psychotherapist of any sort to incorporate body attitudes and breathing and physicality into the therapy.
Because they're all mainstream nowadays.
Absolutely, and they all come from Reich.
Right.
And people don't know that.
Mm-hmm.
No, they don't.
So the armouring, is that like pent up energy then?
Yes.
It's like tension. So like someone who's hunching the shoulders up. That's what it seems like to me, like it's pent up or frustration or something like that. Is that what he's getting at?
You've led beautifully to what I should have said next, Phil. Thank you.
Okay.
You've mentioned energy.
Right.
Again, that's an idea that is fairly accessible to most people. You know, oh, he's got lots of energy. She's not got much energy today. Where's your energy gone today, Mary? Oh, I'm depressed, you know, I've got this and that and the other going on. Energy is an everyday concept to people. You don't need to read a book to get a fingertip feeling for people and their energy. And what Reich discovered, or what his patients told him, was that if you started digging about in these tight muscles and keeping people breathing, they started reporting very powerful body sensations that they always described in terms of something flowing or moving or tingling.
Right.
And it's quite easy to do a little demonstration, you know, it takes 5 or 10 minutes with somebody who's not too armoured to help someone feel these sensations of something moving. And being Reich, he didn't just think, oh, right, something moving, yeah. He thought, he grabbed at it. What is it that's moving? He had this very strong feeling for energy and movement. I think because he was a very alive person himself. And he wondered whether these sensations of motion and expansion, or when someone suddenly bunched up again, you know, tightened up again, a sensation of contraction and shrinking, he wondered whether that was a basic function of nature. Would you be able to see it going on inside tiny little animals? And he homed in on this idea of expansion and contraction, associating expansion with pleasure and contraction with anxiety, which again, I think is a fairly simple idea that lots of people will pick up on straight away.
You can relate that to your body language, certainly, can't you?
Exactly.
Like tensing up, getting small when you're anxious.
Absolutely.
Want to protect yourself, and then feeling more relaxed.
Especially if you've got children.
Yeah.
You know, you can tell straight away where a kid is at 3 or 4, can't you?
Yeah.
You know.
There's two phrases that come to mind. When you tense and then you have that sort of release, there's getting something off your chest.
Yes.
And
yes.
a weight off your shoulders. You know?
Yes.
You know, is that
brilliant? Yes,
sort
absolutely.
of where we're going from? Because that's a definite feel. When
But
you're
it's a sensation,
worried about
that,
something,
isn't it?
It is definitely, yeah.
It's anxiety that brings a physical symptom.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I used to, before I was self-employed, most of my Sundays were ruined because usually around Sunday lunchtime, I would start having this feeling in the pit of my stomach
When heartbeat's on.
about having to go. Well, it used to be Sunday evening. It gradually got earlier and earlier in the day.
Yes.
And it's a physical manifestation of a psychological issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, of course, the discovery, if you boil it down, is that what you're talking about, the sensations and the contraction, is part and parcel of what we in Western culture describe as going on in our head. And the end of Reich's psychological discoveries, as it were, is that, for example, anxiety is not just something between your ears, it's a body process.
Mm-hmm.
And if you undo that process physically, the anxiety will fall away.
This is fundamental, this, isn't it? The
Very.
link between psychology and physiology.
Absolutely.
Because we live in a
Yes.
very mechanistic, reductionist
Yes.
society at the moment, where it's all about breaking things down as small and small and small,
Yes.
and having a link. Consciousness is just a byproduct of chemicals in the brain. It doesn't
That's
really
right.
exist. And also, you get left if you talk about this book that Matt lent me last week, the man who mistook his wife for a hat. He talks about souls in there.
Mm.
Now, a modern psychologist publishing that would probably get ridiculed, talking
Yeah.
about a soul, a human soul, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But this is fundamental, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
The link between brain and body. And so is this where he developed his theory of orgone energy then?
Yes, he sensed, of course, the release of energy and the energy moving in the organism. And this is where what actually led to his discovery of orgone. A Freudian would have just called it libido, you know,
Yeah.
energy behind feelings. And he took to examining amoeba. If you don't know what an amoeba is, if you look at it down a microscope, it's a blobby thing full of dots.
Single-celled organism.
A protozoan, a single-cell organism with no structure to speak of, no skeleton, and it can take any shape it wants. It moves by putting a sort of bit of itself out, pseudopodium it's called, and then the rest follows that bit and so on. And it expands and it contracts. So he'd found, the expansion and contraction at the lowest level in nature.
Right.
That's quite a link,
amoeba.
isn't it?
And he took to examining amoeba and wondered where they came from. And the normal explanation for the origin of amoeba is that they come from spores attached to grass.
Right.
And Reich didn't swallow that, and he started to study grass down his microscope in water, and he found that he could observe amoeba originating from the edge of grass underwater. And I'd witnessed that process myself. That's what started me on my road back to science. I read about the Bion experiments. I'll come to Bions in a minute, and sensed that they were probably right, and I really wanted to have a go at repeating them and checking out Reich's findings. The Bions are these highly mobile little dots that he observed forming on the surface of grass in water and breaking away into the water.
Right.
We call those
Just
Bions.
spontaneously appearing.
That's right.
Right.
And that is, apart from needing a fairly good microscope, that's quite easy to observe. It's not difficult experiments. I've done it more or less as a self-taught beginner. Somebody showed me it once. And a couple of years later, after I'd finished my midwifery training, I had a salary and everything and enough money to buy a microscope. So I bought a microscope and in fear and trembling started these experiments, and I found that I could confirm Reich's findings. Everything he wrote up in his books. There's one book by him called The Bion Experiments on the Origin of Life. And I did those experiments like a nervous beginner cook. If you're learning to cook, you've got the recipe book in one hand and you're looking anxiously at the oven or the pan or whatever you're cooking in. And that's how I did them. I was scared that I'd wasted a fortune on a microscope and it was going to be a waste of money and it all wasn't going to work. But it did work, it really worked with a vengeance.
So is he saying these Bions turn into amoeba? I'm a bit lost about where there was spores. That was a traditional explanation, wasn't it? That the spores land on the grass, is it, and then turn into amoeba?
That's the conventional explanation.
But he witnessed them just appearing out of thin air.
You get separate Bions. They look like a little dancing dot. They're very, very energised and spin round on themselves.
Right.
And you get agglomerations, 2, 3, 4, in the water on their own. But if you have a blade of grass, you'll find that you get a blob of them on the edge of the grass inside a membrane. And they're all busily roaring round, on top of each other, boiling away, very, very energetic. And if you watch for long enough, all of a sudden you'll see this membrane peel off and this organism waddle away into the surrounding water.
And that's the amoeba?
That's the amoeba, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And does that only happen with grass?
No, it seems to happen with some things and not with others, because Reich did a similar experiment with moss and found that also produced amoeba. He tried things like tulip stalks and they didn't for some reason.
Right.
And I've tried various other things and some do and some don't. But you get the Bions, not necessarily the amoeba, but the Bions from almost anything if you let it soak in water and break down, or if it's a mineral material, say like sand, soil, coal dust, charcoal, rocks of various sorts, if you just grind it up fine in a pestle or mortar until it's really fine dust, and you add it to water. Even if you heat supposing it's a mineral material, and you heat it to red heat in a flame, and you boil the water, so everything's totally sterile, you still get these little dancing dots, and you find them forming these agglomerations, little like worms in the water that bend and stretch.
Right.
This might be a stupid question, but it's not the water, is it? Something in the water
No.
rather than the material. No, it just seems like the water was in every example, sort of thing.
Oh, you've got to have water. Yeah, you've got to have a fluid. Yes,
From the water.
Yes, but I'm not quite sure what you mean from the water.
The origin. I think what Phil's getting at is that is the origin of what you see in the water.
The bion, is it the
or
water or the material?
Correct.
Because you're
The
using
bion,
water.
yeah. If you have water on its own, you won't get
Right,
anything.
okay,
You don't
right.
get
You have to
anything.
put something
You
in.
only get the bions if you put something
Right, got you.
into the water.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, the classical practice of microscopy and microbiology would say that what you're seeing potentially is organelles at a low resolution. So your mitochondria.
What are organelles?
Yeah.
So the organelles are the structures within a cell. So,
Yes.
So you get your cell, and then within the cell there's your nucleus, your mitochondria,
Yeah.
endoplasmic reticulum, depending on what you're looking at, all that kind of stuff.
They're not as structured as those.
Well,
Nowhere near as structured.
this is what I'm saying. You're saying dancing dots. Would that be to do with potentially the resolution of the microscope? And my next question would be: has this been repeated using an electron microscope, which wasn't around at the time of these original
No,
experiments?
unfortunately, you can't do it with an electron microscope because that demands a paralysing and killing of whatever you're looking
Yes,
at.
fixing
you
them.
see.
Yeah.
People always ask that question. As far as I know, so far, no one's devised a way of looking at them with electron microscopes.
In the news this week, actually, this is topical. They have developed a microscopic practice method that allows you to view live somatic cells. They're looking at live cells with the resolution of an electron microscope.
Really?
It's very, very new. I read a short article on it early this week.
Oh, well, I'll have to follow that up. If you
Right,
can give
yeah, I
me
was
a
going to
lead.
say,
Yes.
I'll send you the lead.
They're only a
Yeah,
couple
'cause
of £1 million probably for a prototype.
you get
That's
knackered
the-
old electron.
The other thing, a microscope is relatively expensive, but it is within the pocket of an individual. Whereas, as you say, an electron microscope probably does cost millions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, massive as well.
Where does the sterilisation process come in?
Well, the standard, you asked me, what's the standard arguments against orgonomy?
Yeah.
And one of the standard arguments against Reich's Bion claims is contamination, that it's just germs in the water, or germs on the material,
Right.
or Brownian motion,
Ah, yes, Brownian Motion.
which is where Brownian motion comes in. So if you've heated your ground minerals up to red hot heat, that's several hundred degrees centigrade.
Right.
So as far as we know, there's no life forms that can survive such heat.
For a prolonged period.
So you have a spatula, you get your scoop, a metal spatula, you get a scoop of whatever you're using, say sand, and you put it in the flame and you hold it there for a couple of minutes and it starts to glow red all over. If you had a proper lab, you'd be using a Bunsen burner, like you do at school. I haven't got a proper lab and I improvise with a little methylated spirits burner, but it still does the job. And the water you can just boil. Now, there's some argument that there's correct, it's true, that there are some organisms that will survive boiling.
Well, you hear about these vents at the bottom of the sea,
yes,
don't you?
Yes.
Things
But
silly.
to all intents and purposes, in an ordinary domestic environment, I don't think there's very much that's going to survive boiling. If you want, you can sterilize something to, say, 120 or 30 degrees centigrade by autoclaving it, which is what they do in hospitals with surgical instruments. They boil them under pressure. And if you boil water under pressure, you get a much higher temperature, higher than your 100 degrees Celsius, about 120 or 30. And you can do that at home with a pressure cooker. You don't have to have all the fancy gear that a hospital has.
So these, Peter, these Bions are obviously not susceptible to heat in a normal sterilisation.
No.
But must be chemically sensitive. If the fixatives, because there's no fixatives on these slides, is there? I just viewing
no.
your book.
No.
So what, using the fixative, would that destroy the experiment? You wouldn't be able to put a chemical stain and a fixative on your slide, like in the same way you would prep for electron microscopy.
I'm not sure. Some Bion cultures last for a long time.
Right.
So it would be something worth doing that. How long would they last if you put a fixative around the edge of your cover slip and they were completely sealed? I don't know.
Right.
Some Bion cultures, some materials produce Bions, and then they just die away after quite a short time. It's not the same. You don't get the same result from every material.
Oh, right. So it's not like hard and fast.
No.
Okay.
And another thing which is very relevant to how valid the claims are is that you don't get Bions growing in a very alkaline solution with a pH above about 12.
Okay.
A couple of German workers called Palm and Döring discovered that some years ago, and they're no longer active in the field. They've gone back to therapy, but there is a paper written by them where they make this discovery that a Bion culture, a would-be Bion culture, made of something that produces a high pH, is very alkaline or basic, you don't get Bions. They discovered that trying to make a Bion culture out of the sand on the shore in Sri Lanka, which is all made from the shells of biological organisms, full of calcium carbonate.
Oh, okay.
Right.
So you get you get a high pH if you ground those up and add them to water.
Okay. Yeah, that's.
So where are we as far as the list of questions goes?
I don't know. I've pretty much abandoned them, to be honest, because we just got going.
Question 2, I think.
we have covered quite a few of them. You asked me, for listeners who can't say all this, Phil sent me a list of questions, and one of them, what's the standard objection to orgonomy? Well, that's just one important standard objection to the Bion claims.
Brownian motion.
Yes, okay. Is the Brownian motion and the contamination. Now, Brownian motion is very much an issue in this Bion work, because that's the standard objection. Now, again, if you're listening and you don't know what Brownian motion is, it's the motion of tiny particles of any solid material when it's suspended in a fluid. And allegedly, Robert Brown, famous botanist who lived from 1773 to 1858, I think, if I remember correctly, he published a paper in 1828 which actually described the discovery of the Bions, but it's always presented as a discovery of Brownian motion. And nowadays, what Brown presented in that paper is always talked about and written about as what is now called Brownian motion. And Brownian motion does exist, it does occur, and it's quite easy to see it. And there's lots of videos about it on YouTube if anyone wants to follow it up. And if you imagine a tiny little particle, you only get Brownian motion in very small particles, smaller than a micrometer in length or diameter. I think that's the cut-off point. If you have larger particles suspended in a fluid, they're buffeted from all sides by the actively moving molecules of the suspension, and these random motions cancel each other out, so the particle doesn't move.
So are you saying then, rather than Brownian motion being an explanation, an alternative explanation for Bions, it's something separate from it?
Yes, exactly. And if you repeat Brown's experiments, which is relatively easy to do, his experiments, he started with pollen because he was investigating the process of pollination in plants. And he saw pollen grains exploding and spewing out this highly motile stuff, which science at the time referred to as granular matter. And there was a debate, was granular matter alive or not, and it was buzzing with life. And it's obvious if you repeat his experiments that they were actually accidental bion cultures. And it's no big deal to do that. You just get something that produces pollen that you can collect easily, and pop some pollen in some water, and you can see what Brown saw. And I've done that myself quite often. There's a video about it on my YouTube channel, which is Orglanks, all one word. And you can see what pollen looks like.
We'll put
underwater.
links up on the show notes and on Facebook to your YouTube page. How do you... Sorry, go on.
How do I what, please?
How do you make the distinction between Brownian motion and Bions?
Because they are very different. Brownian motion, if you imagine a particle, it's going left and right, north and south, and to and fro towards you and away from you. In other words, it's moving in all planes, bobbing about.
Right.
A Bionus motility is very different. If you imagine a little dot in the water that's asymmetrical, slightly asymmetrical, so that you can tell that it's spinning, it'll be spinning very vigorously on itself. It'll be moving about from point to point, and Bions will be gathering together and forming what Brown referred to as fibrils, a little chain of these dots, 3 or 4 or 5. And they would bend and straighten, and they would also turn on themselves.
Right.
And that's not Brownian motion. Brown himself compared the motion, the bending and stretching, to a worm. He described it as vermicular, which is just a fancy word for worm-like.
Right.
Now, no, Brownian motion has nothing in common with worm-like movement at all. And it's connecting, of course, with expansion and contraction.
Yeah.
And pulsation. Pulsation, according to Reich, is the basic function in nature that you see everywhere. And again, you don't need to know a lot to recognise that. If you think of the way the body works, your digestion pulsates, just like a worm pushing your food along your intestine.
Peristalsis.
Exactly, peristalsis. Your bladder pulsates, it fills, and when it reaches a certain point of expansion, it wants to empty, and it empties, and so on. And your heart pulsating all the time at a much higher rate. The rate of pulsation varies from system to system and organ to organ. Jellyfish pulsates. You imagine a jellyfish wafting in water.
Yeah.
So does that make the difference?
Yeah, well, they sound nothing like each other.
No,
so
they're not
I don't know how you'd
each other.
confuse them.
They're not. They're not like each other. It's a cop-out saying, oh, Brownian motion. It's a complete cop-out. it's very easy to demonstrate the difference. I could, if you, and anyone who's listening who wants to contact me through the website, we can fix up a visit and I can demonstrate the difference to you.
Wow. So this is Core. Shall we get on to Core and how that was founded? And because I think we've gone through, unless you've got some more orgonomy.
I have an orgonomy question about Orgone Accumulators.
Yes.
Which is the
meme, isn't it?
Well, that's you put orgonomy into the
that's the big thing that
to the
comes
internet,
up,
and that's one of the first things that comes up.
And and the unfortunate ending of Reich's career as well.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Which was brought about by the Orgone Accumulator.
Yeah, that's what I mean,
Yes.
Well, should we go back to Reich's story then, and then go through the invention of the accumulator and his troubles with the FDA?
Yes. And Core, you asked about Core.
Yeah, we'll get on to Core. We'll get
So you want to go back to Reich's?
Yeah, let's go back to Reich's story. And
we've got to Norway in the mid-30s, and he's doing these experiments or these investigations with amoeba. And once he'd homed in on amoeba, like Brown, he took it further. He tested inanimate materials, coal dust, charcoal, sea sand, almost anything, garden soil. And he found that almost all these materials, in fact, I think all of them in Reich's investigations, produced bions. And he started to notice that the test tubes holding these cultures literally glowed in the dark, and he sensed that they were giving something off that held against the skin for long enough, they made the skin go red, that he got inflamed eyes from looking at them for so long down the microscope and things like that. So he realised that accidentally he was on the track of this libido to begin with, and then bioenergy. That was his next name for it. And some sort of radiation. To begin with, he was quite anxious because radiation was connected with radioactivity and risks, to human organisms and so on. But he slowly came to the conclusion that what he was working with was harmless. In fact, that was beneficial. He felt very well, very alive and strong and healthy, and it didn't seem to be harming anyone, and he just carried on working with it in spite of the initial anxiety. And he wondered exactly what this radiation was, what were its properties, what would it do or not do. And he started investigating it in a more focused, fairly old-fashioned scientific way. And the obvious way to start within the framework of modern science, still really, would be, well, you try and get a place where you've got this stuff and you see what's going on, and you try and get a similar space where there's none of it and see what's going on, what effect it's having.
Control.
Exactly. And he found that he conducted most of these investigations in a darkened basement in his house in Oslo. And he found that he couldn't get away from the radiation. It was everywhere. And he tried to confine it. And he started by putting the test tubes in a Faraday cage. Do you know what a Faraday cage is?
Yeah.
Everybody's nodding, but maybe I need to explain for listeners. A Faraday cage, if you think of it as a parrot's cage, a bird cage, made of steel, that grounds all electromagnetic radiation that hits it from outside. And it's a standard, conventional item in ordinary school science, physics and so on. It was then in the 1930s, and as far as I know, it still is. And he found that this had no effect. So he thought he would try adding an insulating material round the Faraday cage. And I'm not sure whether he mentions exactly what the material was or whether he just says some insulator. To be honest, I can't remember. So you imagine he got some sort of roof insulation or Celotex or something and put panels of that round the Faraday cage containing the test tubes with the Bion cultures. And he found that this intensified the effects inside, that he'd accidentally invented the Orgone Accumulator. Can I just finish?
Yes,
because the Faraday cage was a layer of steel and then a layer of insulating material. And that seemed to have a concentrating effect. And to cut a long story short, he discovered that steel or iron attracts and repels this radiation that he was homing in on, and an insulator, an electrical insulator, accumulates it. So if you make a box with steel on the inside and then layers of insulated steel, you get a concentration within that's stronger than the ambient concentration outside. Hence the Orgone Accumulator, which is a glorified cupboard big enough to sit in, and the inside is a thin layer of galvanized iron. And then these remaining steel layers, just for the sake of cheapness and convenience, are made of wire wool.
Right.
Which is easy to cut, easy to peel out and into a thin layer. And the conventional material for the insulator, people have used various things. I started with roof insulation, and I still use roof insulation, but other people have used polythene and bubble wrap and polystyrene. People have tried all sorts of things. And the more layers, you call a layer of steel and a layer of insulator one layer.
Yeah.
So a 5-layer accumulator would have 5 layers of steel wool, and the inside one of sheet metal, and 5 layers of insulating material. Right. And the more layers you have, of course, the stronger it is.
Right.
Reich recommended 3 layers, but of course he was working in a continental climate in the States, in a nice rural, he conducted most of his research in a nice rural atmosphere in Maine, up in the hills. The humidity is pretty high in the UK, so I straight away added an extra layer. The first one I built, I had 4 layers, and I've always built them with 4 layers. Right. And I would recommend anyone who's thinking of building one, to start straight away with 4 layers because of the dampness. That's another of his accidental discoveries, that moisture retains orgone energy. Water and orgone energy are drawn to each other. So if there's a lot of moisture in the air, an orgone accumulator doesn't work so well. And in a place like England, where you get a big variation from day to day, one day your accumulator will work very well, where it's blue sky and nice high white clouds and things, high pressure weather. And when it's rainy and damp and misty, the accumulator will have a very slow draw, and if you're used to using one, you can tell, that it's not nearly so effective then.
How do you know the difference?
When you sit in an accumulator, if your own energy is fairly healthy and responsive, after, say, 10 minutes, you'll start to feel a pleasant buzz. Through the best way of describing it, in your body. If you put your hand close, you don't touch, but put your hand close to the outside wall, you'll maybe feel a tingle. Now, someone who's very, very armoured, heavily armoured, wouldn't feel those. They might have to sit in an accumulator every day, say for an hour, every day for a few weeks before their own energy had tanked up enough to have a reaction. But, a fit young person should feel a reaction straight away. And one of the very scientific demonstrations of the effects of the accumulator is a small rise in temperature, which is, you just cannot gainsay it. You know, I've checked it dozens and dozens of times, both in myself and other people, and I've seen other people with other accumulators check people's temperature. You take it before you go in. For example, your basic degree in centigrade nowadays is 36, what used to be 98.4 when I was a kid. You sit in your accumulator for, say, 15, 20 minutes, and you take it again, and it might be 36.3, 0.4, it might be even 37. If your own energy metabolism is very strong and responsive, and the atmospheric conditions round about are good, you know, it could go up as much as a degree centigrade. But again, it's not mechanistic, you see. It depends on the individual, A, the individual, and B, on the conditions, the ambient weather at the moment. But if you know about P numbers, getting a small rise in temperature again and again and again and again, you know, for years and years, every time, that is a highly significant finding.
Yeah.
Very significant indeed. And I don't know how mainstream science would explain that away. And while we're on proofs, as it were, another connected item is a very simple experiment. You know, an 8 or 10-year-old kid could do this experiment. You can make a small experimental accumulator, which looks quite like the big one that you sit in, and it's about a cubic foot on the outside, maybe a bit more, and the inside's a bit less than a cubic foot. And you can prepare batches of seeds which are identical, absolutely identical. Same number of seeds, same weight of soil, give them the same amount of water, and you keep them in the same room at the same temperature. And the only difference is that your experimental batch sits in your little accumulator for 4 or 5 hours in the middle of the day when the atmospheric orgone energy is expanded to its maximum. And they are therefore in the dark. So your control batch you put in the dark as well. And when you take your accumulator batch out, you know, you remove your controls from the cover and you water them at identical times, the same amount. And supposing you are germinating cress seeds, some common or garden thing, you know, that you can buy for 20, 30p from any garden shop, you will find after 5 or 6 days that there's a really, really significant difference in the height of the orgone-treated seedlings compared to the controls. And again, that's an experiment that's been done by many, many people in many different countries, you know, and I've done it several times myself.
Is it do you think it's the metal or the insulation in the...
Well, it's both. It's the effect of both together.
So if you had how I would do it, I didn't say this before, but I am a scientist.
I can
worked in
tell.
microbiology for many years. But how I would run it is I'd have my Orgone Accumulator box.
Yes.
And I'd have an identical box.
Yes.
Without the steel, so it would be the same thickness, the same.
You can do that, and
of layers of
people
insulation.
have done that. Yes.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
So then you reduce your variables, because if you had if you had one in a box and then one just like under a dark mug or something, it'd be.
I mean, you're talking about constructing an experiment now, you know, with terminology like variables. Absolutely, you know, I couldn't agree more. Do everything to produce an experiment that a mainstream scientist would acknowledge as authentic. Yeah.
Well, it's good that that's been done.
There's been 2 randomized controlled trials done on human beings in accumulators in Germany and Austria. One chap who conducted them did it as part of an MSc at Vienna University.
Right.
When was this?
He constructed, I'm not sure of the details, but he had an accumulator, obviously, and he constructed, or somebody else constructed, a thing that looked like an accumulator, but had no accumulating facility.
Right.
Now, how you do that, I'm not sure, because the inside layer of metal is obviously recognisably metal.
Yes.
Perhaps he had some pretend,
Maybe plastic or something.
plastic that looked metallic.
possibly,
I don't know, but it is must be possible to do it. And people, sat in the control container and a real accumulator, and they measured their vital signs, temperature, pulse, and blood pressure, and the accumulator had a significant and measurable effect, whereas the control container didn't.
Wow.
That's the way to do it.
Yeah.
I assume these people that were selected to go in, they were just selected to take part in a study, were they?
Yeah.
Yeah,
They didn't know what they were.
yeah. They're trying to control
it was
out.
a truly
pre-
randomised. You know
Yeah.
what a randomised control
Yeah.
trial is? It's considered the gold standard
Yeah.
for any medical or biological research, scientific research. It's very difficult in orgonomic research to actually construct a randomised control trial, because with a true trial of that sort, the experimental subject doesn't know whether they're getting the treatment or not.
Yeah.
They can be given
Double blind.
double blind, and even the experimenter doesn't know. Whereas if you're trying to demonstrate the effect of orgone therapy, for instance, digging into someone's muscles and working with their breathing, there's no way you can disguise that. Somebody knows what's being done to them.
Yeah. It's not like a pill where you
Yeah,
can give someone the
exactly.
sugar pill and
Exactly. But the experiment I was talking about, the seed germination, in one way it's very pure in that there's no placebo effect. We presume there's no placebo effect with seeds. You rule out the placebo
You never know.
effect. You see, people who are pro-orgonomy, will sit in an accumulator and say, oh, my temperature's gone up, orgone energy, it's great, isn't it? Look at that, fancy that, I feel super. And they'll rush off, telling the world how wonderful orgonomy is, and I can't stand that. That's not what I want. I want, serious, down-to-earth, grounded research that people can't pick apart. Yeah. Somebody sitting in an accumulator once and getting a temperature rise, that can be talked away, as you will know. Any skeptic can quite rightly say, oh, well, once means nothing. Whereas if you get a much smaller rise again and again, repeatedly, regularly, then that's far more significant.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Right. So Reich built the first Orgone Accumulator, and is this what landed him in trouble, or was it these books?
Not the first one, but the very first one, I'm not sure whether it was made in Norway or America, because it all happened towards the end of his time in Norway.
Right.
And he escaped from Norway by the skin of his teeth. He got to America on the last liner that made it to America from Norway before the war started.
Right.
So it was a very narrow squeak indeed. And I'm guessing that he hadn't built an accumulator, but as soon as he got to the States, he started building them and experimenting with them in all sorts of ways. And all this is written up in the sequel to The Function of the Orgasm, which is the cancer biopathy. The function is the discovery of the orgone part 1, and the cancer biopathy, its proper name is the discovery of the orgone part 2. And that, if anyone wants to read up on the history, the experiments and so on that they carried out that led eventually to the Orgone Accumulator and the Bion experiments, that's the book to read. Right. He started off in New York, which is very damp and humid, like it is here in the summer, I believe. I don't know New York well. And so he looked for some premises out in the country, with nice, fresh, clear, bright conditions. And he bought a derelict farm in Maine, which is... he bought that with a loan from an admiring patient and paid the loan back quite quickly. And that place still exists, and it's now the Wilhelm Reich Museum.
Ah, yeah.
And they have a conference every summer on one or other aspect of orgonomy.
Have you been over to that?
Yes, I have. Yeah, it's a great place to visit, and I've been invited to contribute to a conference next summer.
Very good.
Very good.
On,
Can you take guests?
three guests.
anyone can go. You know, if you're willing to pay to get to the States and stay there,
That's
I
the tricky
recommend
part.
it as a fantastic experience. It's because you really soak up the atmosphere of Reich's working world. You know,
What time of year is it held at?
July, I think.
Summer holidays.
I recommend it to anyone who is remotely interested in orgonomy. It's a great experience, and as well as the actual conference, you can wander around the museum and explore it at leisure, and see the equipment he used. And
Did you say that was
like
in
that.
Maine? Did you say?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's but the nearest big city is Portland, I believe. Portland,
Oregon.
Maine.
Yeah.
Excellent.
No, not the one in Oregon.
side.
There's one in Oregon, and there's one on the east coast in Maine.
Maine
Oh,
is
is it?
in
Oh, yeah.
Massachusetts,
I thought
isn't
Maine
it?
was in the middle.
No, Maine is
no.
on the northeast coast.
Oregon is. Sorry.
Yeah.
Geography
Boston
is
and
awful.
Maine.
Yes, Boston.
It's
yeah.
Massachusetts, I think.
Okay.
You're quite right. There is a Portland in
In the middle. In
Oregon. In
Yeah.
Oregon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So he constructed the first. Well, he settled in Maine,
Yeah.
and that's what did he do next?
He started building. He employed a man, a carpenter, joiner, building a practical chap, who made lots of orgone accumulators, and he started renting them out, the
Right.
token rent, to people who were very ill. And he conducted experimental therapy with people who had cancer, who were known to have cancer, and who'd been written off by mainstream medicine. And again, if anyone wants to read about this, it's in the Cancer Biopathy. And he had this very, very optimistic idea that cancer was brought about by what he called a stasis, a traffic jam, as it were, a standstill of your orgone energy in the organism. And if you tanked people up, recharged people in the orgone energy accumulator, their energy might start moving again, and it might start breaking the tumour down. And remember, these were all people who were very far gone, given up by mainstream medicine. And he did in fact find that his hopes were fulfilled to some extent, but the patients all ended up dying anyway because their rather battered, damaged organisms couldn't cope with the process of the tumour breaking down and dumping the breakdown products.
Cracky.
Would that be metastasis? Would it not create tumours elsewhere?
Yes, of course. I mean, I see. No, it didn't make them have more tumours. No, it just made the tumours they have, in the best cases, in the best scenarios, it made those tumours break down. But the body's got to get rid of that, you know. And if the body's already been very ill for years and years, its excretory system is not going to be at its best.
No.
And people ended up dying, you know, of clogged kidneys, basically,
Right. I see. Yeah.
Bloody hell.
as I understand
Yeah,
him.
no filtering.
But quite a few of the patients' lives were prolonged, and their pain levels were much reduced. And that's one of the very positive things about the accumulator. It seems to stimulate very positively all the body's natural healing processes. So it's a good, low-key pain reliever.
That's very useful.
So if I was to play devil's advocate
Yeah, please do.
and then say, you know, if we talked about the placebo effect,
Yes.
and you gave someone and said, right, you're in a bit of pain, you've got cancer and whatnot, or in a lot of pain, and they get them, potentially someone who's quite a desperate person,
Yes.
it's like dying of cancer, terminal cancer or whatever, and you say, look, you've had these people, they've had good results from going into this, they buy into that,
Yes. Yes.
that reduces their anxiety, and there's an association in research between anxiety and pain and
Yes,
how
yes,
much you
yes,
feel
yes,
it.
yes.
There's a lot of research, between that. So how would you, differentiate between that placebo potentially and orgone energy?
It would be very difficult to.
You'd have to do a double-blind study with cancer patients.
Yeah, I
and give,
suppose.
it's not ethical to do experiments like that, is it?
I'm out of a stab at this. So you said that the
Can I answer your question?
Yeah,
Excuse
sorry.
me. Or try and answer it. Reich did everything he could to not raise unrealistic expectations. And you're quite right. I mean, even now, occasionally, very occasionally, I get contacted by someone who knows nothing about orgonomy, and they've heard by sheer chance about the orgone accumulator. Supposing you've got a chap, his wife's been given 6 months to live, an old lady, she's got cancer, and he comes across the orgone accumulator online somewhere, and he tracks me down. This is literally, has happened. And you're right in the middle of that predicament. You have to do everything you can to play down expectations. You can't peddle the accumulator as a cure for cancer, and Reich never did. He was accused of doing so, but he didn't do that. And I would, if anything, backpedal the other way, say all we can do is give it a chance. And the obvious thing is, in fact, to apply Reich's discoveries long time before people get cancer, or when the cancer's a tiny little lump somewhere, rather than a great big lump that's eating them away. In practice, this research has met a dead end. No one's doing anything in the field at all to speak of, apart from the odd enthusiastic amateur, who discovers it and makes one for themselves. But I don't know of any medical people. There is one chap in Italy. Actually, he's not a doctor. He's a biologist, PhD biology worker, and he's, as far as I know, treating cancer patients with the accumulator.
Right.
And he monitors it very carefully because he's a biologist. He's also a microscopist, and he takes samples of their tumours and things. If you want to follow it up, I can find a lead for you.
Yeah.
Excellent.
No. Yeah.
Going back to, was it the results from the cancer treatments he was doing that got him, that first made him come to the attention of the FDA in the States when he started being pursued by them?
I'm not certain what exactly. I think what really drew him to their attention was actually a journalist's article.
Oh.
There was a journalist wrote an article called The Strange Case of Wilhelm Reich, a woman called Mildred Brady Eddy, I forget her name now. And she was hostile to Reich, and she wrote the article to do him down.
Did she not refer to sex boxes or something like that, basically?
She implied that it was a sex racket.
Yeah.
And if you look at the FDA, that's the Food and Drugs Administration, their responsibility is to monitor drugs and medical treatment and so on in the US, and they still exist. Their attitude was that this was some sort of secret money-making sex racket. They couldn't imagine that the orgone accumulator was a simple medical device that Reich was feeling his way with, And because people were paying a token rent, as far as I know, it was quite token, he wasn't making much money out of it at all. If anything, as far as I know, he fed the rent money into the production of further orgone accumulators. He wasn't pocketing money at all. But they couldn't imagine anyone doing something like that, for the good of other people's souls. Some people just can't imagine human beings doing something for the good of other people.
Especially not in America.
Yeah. So he was, technically speaking, arraigned for trafficking unapproved medical device across state borders. Now that's a technical American offence. We haven't got
Makes
states.
it federal, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yes, it's to do with different things in different states. And there was an injunction slapped on him and his organisation, saying that he couldn't trade in these gadgets, the Orgone Accumulator, and he couldn't traffic them from one state to another. And while Reich was away and not in control of things, one of his assistants moved an accumulator from Maine to New York, I think it was. Anyway, across an interstate border, and it got picked up, which meant that they'd technically contravened the injunction, which means you're in breach of you committed contempt of court.
Right.
And contempt of court anywhere is a very severe offence.
Yeah.
They take it out on you. And he was given a 2-year prison sentence for that. And he didn't make it. He died just before he came up for parole of heart trouble. He had a long history of heart trouble. And he just died in his sleep, as far as we know.
It seems that sort of technical offence of, accumulators crossing state borders is just sort of a thin veneer, because I read that they burnt his books, which sounds like complete gross censorship.
As well as the injunction not to trade with them and to move them about, the injunction ordered, as you correctly say, the burning of all his books, the destruction of all the remaining accumulators, and one or two other things, I think. Anyway, believe it or not, his books were burnt. He's, as far as we know in history, the only person whose books were burnt by the Nazis and somewhere else. And book burning in America is, I dare say, that's the only one, there hasn't been another one since. It's very, very rare indeed.
Maybe the Quran.
What was the
individual books?
Yeah.
Not en masse.
Not federally
Yeah.
encouraged book burning.
But in the 50s
Orwellian, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. In the 50s in America, though, what were the show trials? What was that? The era
McCarthyite.
Yeah.
Those
Because that was all
communists.
And he was a communist, did you not
They
say?
did suspect he was a communist, but he managed to prove that he wasn't any longer. He had been. And they sort of wrote him off as safe, and as not a security risk. So that's not part of it.
Right.
In fact, the people who shopped him to the FDA were communists. The communists were very, very hostile to Reich.
Really?
Because of his mass psychology book.
Right, okay.
Right, so... Yes, the book you talked about at the beginning, the mass psychology of Nazis, fascism.
Yeah,
you can relate that to socialism and communism, can't you? Two sides of the same coin.
They didn't like him sort of showing up their weaknesses and their mistakes and errors and things. Yeah.
There was one other question I wanted to ask about, especially about Reich. I've seen read some explanations about some of where some of his ideas came from, because he was what he described. He said, I think he described he had his first sexual experience when he was 4, and whether that's true or not, I don't know. It was like a secondary quote or whatever. But some people said that he came across as a person who had been abused as a child, and that maybe had an influence on where all this kind of thing came from, especially relation to sex and things like that.
I think I know who you mean.
I don't know. I can't remember who it was.
I'm not certain. I think it's a man called Roger Wilcox, who is a sort of professional critic of Reich.
Right, okay.
And I have heard that. It rings a bell that he comes across as someone who might have been sexually abused as a child.
I mean, that doesn't necessarily make you, then go on to just make loads of things up about stuff. But I don't know, maybe that's why I had an interest in those kinds of things, I suppose.
Yes, I think it's obvious that something must have happened in Reich's life that made him understand and appreciate the importance of sexuality. The function of the orgasm, that's what it's about. That the orgasm isn't just a nice thing, it's a biological regulator,
right,
as it were. And my reading of it is that maybe you don't know this history, and maybe lots of the listeners don't. Reich's mother had an affair with one of Reich's tutors. Reich was educated a lot at home, and he had this tutor who was very interested in natural history and biology and animals and things, and apparently inspired some of his later interests. And Reich betrayed this affair to his own father.
Yeah.
And his mother ended up committing suicide. I think when he was sort of 10, 11, 12, something like that.
Yeah.
Now, it seems to me that if that happens in your own family, if somebody, your mother, you can't get more important than that, can you, kills themselves because of sex, to put it, in a very stereotypical, inverted commas, you're going to think, bloody hell, this is important, isn't it? This matters. This is a huge, huge lesson. And all sorts of people, when their lives are affected by some shattering trauma as a child, go on, to be interested in that thing for the rest of their life, don't they? It's a common experience. But that doesn't invalidate it to me. It doesn't mean, oh, he was wrong and sex is rubbish. It's just a trivial pleasure. Maybe it's a very valid lesson to learn.
Well, the other thing as well is this kind of thought arises from the time that you live in as well, doesn't it? And how much of a taboo sex and having an affair now is still a taboo, isn't it? But how much sex was a taboo, or talking about sex
in 1950s America?
Well, earlier than that, wasn't it? When he was a child.
That's when he came in trouble.
Then and earlier when he was forming his ideas.
If you're talking about his mother, that would have been, Reich was born in 1910, say, something like that. And there would have been much bigger taboo, both on having an affair and talking about it, and being open about it, yes. I mean, it's very, very relevant to modern times, actually. Now, the thing has turned completely the other way. When Reich was a young psychoanalyst, he was trying to liberate sex for teenagers.
Yeah.
And there's a very poignant picture painted by somebody, or maybe it's an engraving, and it's called something like "In Love and Nowhere to Go." Reich had a copy on his wall somewhere, I think. And it's a teenage boy and a teenage girl in the sort of industrial slums of Vienna, hiding with their arms round each other in this dark street, And that was the sexual lot of teenagers when Reich was a teenager, or a young man. Now, and so he was doing his best to liberate sexuality for young working class adolescents, and he campaigned, and he had an organisation in Berlin, and he talked, he had huge meetings, with young people, educating them about sex.
Yeah.
And now it seems to me quite the opposite.
It is, isn't it?
And I actually met a young person who did this. It crossed my mind, thinking about Reich and the present-day history, that maybe it might be a bit healthier as a teenager to abstain from sex, because nowadays so much teenage sex is totally pornographic and sick and weird and loveless and not very nice at all. And I imagined, obviously I'm an old man now, I tried to imagine myself into the heart and mind of a sort of 16, 18-year-old girl now, And lo and behold, I bumped into one, just sheer coincidence, and that's exactly what she'd done. She'd come up against this sort of raging, rampant pornographic sex culture as a university student. She was older than that now. She was a young woman of about 24, 25. And she just felt in her guts, I just don't want anything to do with this. And she totally rejected it and sort of kept to herself. In you might say, a rather prim Victorian, you know, she'd more or less followed old-fashioned Victorian morality. And it struck me that that's possibly, I mean, I wouldn't lay the law down about it, but in 2018-19, maybe that's more wholesome, you know, than watching a lot of pornographic sex online.
Mm-hmm. It's seen more purely as just a biological function now, isn't it? And a lot of the emotional context is taken out.
Yes.
Through the way porn is everywhere. It's in advertising. It's on TV. Yeah, looking around this room. Sorry, I'm not helping the situation, am I? But I'm a grown man. I can deal with it.
There's a lot of pressure, isn't there, as well?
Pressure amongst young kids, I'd say so, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's just some thoughts, you know.
Yeah.
But it shows to me how relevant Reich is to the present.
Yeah.
You know?
That was one of my questions, really, is what are the implications of, you know, to this day and age of this work?
Well, Reich was... He wasn't just for having sex. He was for having what he called healthy sex. Mm-hmm. He, in his early psychoanalytic days, he wondered, you know, what... Again, it's something that very few people ever wonder about. What really is sexual health? What is healthy sex as opposed to pornographic sex? Sex that satisfies people, you know, and leaves people feeling good about themselves and about each other. He talks about feeling tenderness and gratitude towards the partner, you know, as one of the consequences of a healthy sexual embrace. You know, well, how often could people say that nowadays after a sex act? So part of his function, and anyone can read this in the book, is a summary of these early investigations. And he was talking to people, and he was face to face with droves and droves of young people, you know, who were impotent, who were frigid, who couldn't do this, couldn't do that, all sorts of weird, warped sexual obsessions and perversions and things. And he described some of them as case histories. And he ran a counselling service, you know, but he realised it was a drop in the ocean. That, you know, when you're surrounded with 2,000 or 3,000 young people from the industrial slums of Vienna or Berlin, there's not a lot you can do for people beyond tell them about the facts of life and inform them about contraception and abortion and things, you know, because in those days, of course, girls were dying. From illegal abortions and things.
I think that's the thing I read about him, was that he was a proponent, wasn't he, for abortion, like when he was in Vienna.
Yes.
But a thing that I've sort of picked up from the various kinds of different things was in Vienna. Was there not like this? I don't know if it was underground or a mainstream kind of culture before kind of the Nazis came and fascism and all the rest of it, of quite being sexually liberal and people living in different genders, like homosexuality being quite open. Am I sort of making that up around that time, in like the 20s?
That sounds like Weimar Germany. Mm-hmm. So perhaps Vienna was a bit like that too.
Right, okay.
Because it's not going to happen in one big city and not in another, is it?
Yeah.
So probably, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I suspect you're talking about a fairly narrow, comfortable segment of the population. And Reich was talking about the industrial workers.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah.
Yeah.
It would have been, yeah.
Whose sexual culture would have been very different.
Mm-hmm. Would have been dominated by religion still.
Yes. Yeah. And fear and anxiety and ignorance.
Yeah. The consequences, aren't they, I suppose, of getting pregnant or whatever, or having a child with somebody then, and having no money, nowhere to live, all the rest of it, and then being ostracised as well. You know, that's pretty...
It would have been terrible.
Yeah.
It would have been terrible. Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, that would be a huge motivation for all these illegal, potentially lethal abortions that girls went for. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sad that, isn't it? And it's gone on forever.
Yeah.
And it still goes on
still
today.
Going on.
Northern Ireland.
Yeah, exactly.
Still going on.
I think I think did Parliament in London, did they not force it recently?
Don't know. There's controversy over it, isn't there?
I think they forced it, didn't they? Because they have thingies. Anyway, segue.
Talk about that another time.
Yeah.
Obviously, the biggest sort of effect of this research seems to be medicinal.
Yes. Medical, yes.
And maybe spiritually, because it raises interesting questions about life itself and where life comes from, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Couldn't agree more. Yeah.
It's sort of, I don't know. What do you think of the implications, like the big implications for different spheres that we live in today?
Well, that was one of your questions, wasn't it? And I did
Probably.
think about
I might
that.
have butchered it.
I would think the biggest implications are for medicine and possibly social policy in the long run. And Reich's big passion by the time he got to the end of his life was what he called prevention.
Right.
You know, so however wonderful his therapy might have been, it's just, you know, how many people can a therapist treat in a lifetime? You know, it's a tiny, tiny number. And while you're treating them, or virtually every baby is forming some armouring, because people don't know about the importance of children's primary needs. And they don't know that children form armouring, and they don't know about the bad effects of armouring. And Reich had this wonderful project, which he called the Orgonomic Infant Research Project, to collect a small number of parents and new babies, you know, and try and see what you could do to bring them through without any armouring, without any damage. And it folded, partly because of conflict between the participants and partly because of his legal difficulties. And it's still not been done to this day.
Right.
But that's to my mind, that's a much better way of using his discoveries than trying to, say, treat cancer.
Yeah, because it's just the practicalities of using something like an accumulator, especially if it has to be occupied day after day for a length of time. Sort of early intervention is what you're looking at, isn't it? To try and have the best results.
Yes.
So is he saying that armouring is brought on through psychology or psychological damage? Is that where it starts through childhood then?
Yes.
Well, the other thing is even now there's a big push towards like perinatal mental health. So like when a woman's pregnant, and the effect of anxiety or extreme anxiety on a fetus, and it can cause developmental issues. The biological link between that, apparently.
Absolutely, yes. And there's tentative evidence to suggest that the orgone accumulator could be used to moderate that anxiety because it engenders expansion.
Mm-hmm.
Reich used the accumulator on his own son. His wife had a baby in 1944, right in the middle of the heyday of the orgone accumulator. And she used it, you know, without any sense of harm at all. I mean, it's anecdotal. It's only one case. I think probably quite a few other women have used it. But the lovely thing about working with babies is it's so easy to undo armouring in a baby because it's only been there for 5 minutes and a baby wants to get rid of it. You know, grown-ups don't want to get rid of their armouring. They're proud of their armouring. You know, those shoulders that you were miming so beautifully, you know. Lots of blokes with shoulders like that are proud of them, aren't they, you know? Oh, I'm a big, strong chap, you know, you can't defeat me.
Yeah, babies don't have egos, do they?
No, exactly. And you can feel the tensions in a baby's body and melt them away so easily. It's just amazing how effective it is with a baby.
My wife is, I've got a 3-month-old, nearly 4-month-old baby, and she's having sessions with a baby massage therapist.
Yes.
And the impact that has on him, you can see how much more relaxed he is.
Yeah,
And that's a well-known kind of thing, isn't it? That massage and that relation to babies, and they just kind of zone out and they'll drop asleep when they wouldn't before and all the rest of it.
That is a big advance in our culture, the fact that you can go to a baby massage session through your GP or something. That is a big advance.
Yeah.
I mean, the people who do that would be even better at it if they knew about armouring and energy. But still, it's a lot. Must go a long way.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
But it's just that I just thought of that link, between what you were saying. That's all.
Just the link between physical contact that babies have. I mean, I'm probably going to get this wrong, but I'm sure there was research done with babies that didn't have physical contact for a long period were really badly affected.
Well,
just physical contact between the mother and the child.
There's that thing, isn't there? There's a famous, it's a horrible experiment they did with baby monkeys.
Yes.
And they had a soft fake mother to cling to, or a hard one. And it was awful, and then nothing to scare them, and they kind of cowered in the corner rather than cling on to the hard. But anyway, so it had an impact into it, and eventually it really messed them up, not having that kind of physical contact with something.
You see, even now, lots of parents don't know about that. They don't know about the importance of skin to skin and carrying. You can, with a 3-month-old, you can do this experiment. Just try carrying your baby for several hours. I don't mean for 10 minutes.
Well, I do.
And you can see a baby who's carried, it just hangs there, flops.
Yeah. Well, no, after a while, you do notice with him, quite shortly, you start off and he's kind of grabbing your shoulders, he's clinging at you, pawing at you, and eventually I feel his arms drop and he zones out, and that's when he normally falls asleep. Yeah. Eventually.
Yes.
He gets relaxed. But the other thing as well with that is baby carriers.
Yes.
He's much more relaxed in a baby carrier than he is if I'm holding him, because he's pressed against my chest or my wife's chest.
Yes.
And he just kind of sits there quite happily rather than...
That's right.
It probably goes right back to our evolution. When we were hunter-gatherers, the baby or the young child, toddler, had to be carried because of predation.
Yeah.
It's like we say it every week pretty much, all humans are born premature.
Yes.
Because of the size of the birth canal
and
ratio to the skull. We're helpless, whereas a deer is born and it has to be up on its feet, sharpish, otherwise it's dead meat. Put too fine a point
Which
on it.
brings me to something I always plug. You're absolutely right, Phil.
Bambi.
There's a book about this, and it's called A Continuum Concept, and anyone who's listening and who's a parent or thinking of becoming a parent should get a copy. There's thousands of them secondhand for next to nothing. It's called The Continuum Concept, and the author is called Jean Liedloff. She's dead now. And that's about a tribe in the Amazon jungle where they carried the babies till they were big enough to crawl. Right. And exactly the same philosophy that you're talking about. You can't wheel babies about there, because there's no pavements. There's just soil and jungle and things.
Yeah.
And the babies were quite soft and unarmoured, and very, when they started to grow up and run around and walk, they were very self-sufficient, very fearless, but safe. They had a natural feeling for their own safety. Lovely book, well worth reading.
It's like our modern society is interfering with our evolution in a way.
That's right.
And we have these labour-saving devices, or prams, or whatever you want to call them, and they sort of interfere with what's been happening for 300 or 250,000 years. If you suddenly stop that at the age of 0 months to 3 months, it's got to have an impact, hasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, this is what orgonomy brings you up against, if you look at it deeply enough, what you're talking about. It's great that you've thought of them rather than me peddling them.
You should talk about your book while you're here. The one that you've brought here. Is this your latest book?
One of the books.
Well, actually, I'll come to that. But if we've got any time left, there's one or two things.
Oh, well, just before you start, when was the bus you were going to
We're at 10:10 now.
It's 10:10 now.
Right, well, I've got to get the next one then. I think it's 10:38.
Right.
10:35. So
we'll have to think about wrapping up soon.
Yes, right. I wanted to explain core.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Core, stands for centre, which I'm not happy with, because centre's very abstract. But the word core is one of Reich's words. He talked about a baby's core needs. Mm-hmm. The absolute centre of your very being. And an adult's core needs as well. So I like the idea of that, and that's why I've stuck to core as a shorthand for a focus on that. The book is about my discovering that Einstein and an assistant of his published a book together called The Evolution of Physics in about 1936, 7, something like that, in which they convey Brown's discovery of Brownian motion in a blatantly fraudulent manner. They have a long quote with a bit in the middle left out. And when you check up on the bit that they've left out, it's the embarrassing bit that refers to the pulsatory motion that we were talking about earlier.
If you go back to Brown's original paper.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
And if you go back to Brown's experiments themselves, you find that he described what he saw very, very carefully. He was obviously a brilliant observer, and that he was in fact describing the Bions.
And that's artificers of fraud.
That's right.
Easy for me to say.
Artificers of fraud is a quote from Milton, if you're wondering where the title comes from. Right. It's Milton's description of the devil, the artificer of fraud.
Paradise Lost.
That's right. Yeah. Well, we've run out of time, haven't we, I think?
Well, Peter, it's been an absolute pleasure.
You have to come back, Peter, because I want to know about why you became a midwife as well.
Okay, fine.
We'd be welcome to have you back.
Thank you.
Where can people find out more?
Well, I've got a huge rambling website, Orgonomy, Orgonomy, orgonomyuk.org.uk.
Okay, sorry, go on.
There's pages on all the topics that we've touched on tonight.
Brilliant. Well, we'll put a link to that in our show notes and on our Facebook page. Mm-hmm. And we'll also put the YouTube. You've got a YouTube channel, haven't you?
Yes.
So we'll put that link up as well. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there's anything else to say this week other than thank you very much for coming.
Yes. Thank you for having me.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you. And we'll sign off this week and come back next week.
Yes.
We'll talk about something else.
Whenever.
Who knows?
Cricket.
Yeah, maybe the cricket. All right. Thanks a lot, eavesdroppers. Wakanda forever. Have a nice week. Ta-ra.
Really?